Make sure Araceli is with us to run things.
We're all good.
We're good? Okay, great. All right, so thank you to everyone who stayed with us all morning. Hopefully you guys are learning a little bit more detail about the rules we are proposing to develop. For those of you just joining us, I'm Jody Bechtel. I'm the Deputy Director of Clark County's Department of Environment and Sustainability. We are here as the Division of Air Quality today, or DAQ, and we are talking about rule development for our state implementation plan submission requirements under the moderate non-attainment for the 2015 Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standard. So DAQ serves as the air pollution control agency for Clark County, and on this screen just shows you the folks that have been involved in the rulemaking and attainment efforts to date. So in January of this year, when we were notified of our bump up to moderate non-attainment, we held a public meeting talking about the situation we're experiencing with ozone and kind of discussed the situation and requirements in detail. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail this morning since we're focusing on the rules, just providing a little bit of background, but I do encourage you to go watch the video. It is on our website, and that link has been posted in the chat. If you scroll up, you'll see it. So you can watch that video. You can watch other recordings of the previous stakeholder meetings we've had. And then this series of stakeholder meetings on the proposed rules will also be posted to that website. So for the Las Vegas Valley, formerly the hydrographic area, HA212, we were in marginal non-attainment for ozone with the previous standard. Once that standard was lowered to 0.070 parts per million, we have been bumped up to what is called a moderate non-attainment situation, and we are required to develop the state implementation plan and identify actions that will reduce our emissions and get us back into attainment. Also of note, the EPA continually reviews the standards for the regulated pollutants. Ozone is one of those standards, and they are reviewing that ozone standard for consideration of lowering it further, in which case we could be subject to an increased non-attainment standard, and we could be bumped up to a serious non-attainment standard if we can't get our emissions and actions to control our attainment and get back into attainment, excuse me. So this table just shows some of the rules that we're considering and looking to promulgate. So we must establish emission control requirements in the state implementation plan. The moderate non-attainment designation requires certain things, and a couple of those things are that we assess our reasonably available control technology, or RACT, requirements on area sources. We are required to provide a 15% rate of progress, reducing volatile organic compounds by 15% independent of any reductions necessary for attainment. And we are also required to come up with any contingency measures that we would be able to implement if we aren't able to get into attainment by August of 2024 with the RACT and ROP efforts that we would be promulgating. So again, this table just kind of shows you for those different requirements, the rules that we're considering and where they would fall to meet those requirements. So this table then identifies the statutory deadlines and timelines that we're under. We are under a retroactive deadline, which is rather unique for us as well as our regulated community. But we were notified on the 5th of January that we were required to submit a state implementation deadline on the 1st of January. And obviously we are working as expeditiously as possible to get the SIP together and actions identified and rules promulgated that would help us meet that attainment date. EPA is aware, obviously, that the deadline is unrealistic and is okay so long as we're working expeditiously and showing good faith progress to develop the SIP. So we work with them very closely to demonstrate that. But because we were working under such a tight deadline that we're pushing for these rules pretty hard. We understand that that is kind of problematic, and we appreciate that. We're doing our best to hear your concerns while still meeting the EPA requirements for this attainment SIP. If we don't get the SIP submitted in a timely manner and get these rules promulgated, EPA could start a sanctions clock that could lead to our loss of federal highway funds for Clark County, as well as other penalties. It would also allow EPA to impose a federal implementation plan to implement control requirements. So this is our stakeholder meeting schedule for for this week. For the next couple of days, we've got this is our last rule stakeholder meeting for today. We'll be talking about graphic arts, and then please join us again if you're interested in learning more about the asphalt and gasoline dispensing facilities rules. On the 13th, we will have additional consumer products and architectural industrial maintenance coding workshops coming up, hopefully fairly quickly, and get those at least scheduled and on the calendar fairly quickly. And then we still need to identify which contingency measures we're going to promulgate, and those will be forthcoming as well. And again, I mentioned that these stakeholder workshops are being posted to this website that's shown on the slide here and has been posted into the link. As a link into the chat, excuse me. And with that, I will turn it over to Lynn Hutchinson with RTP, and she will discuss the graphic arts rules that we're proposing.
Turn that all on. Okay, so everybody seeing my screen and seeing me?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right, welcome everyone to the final workshop of the day. We're going to talk about the graphic arts CTGs. A little bit of background: EPA issued 3 CTG documents that cover the graphic arts industry. The first of those was in 1978, and the next 2 were both in 2006. The first CTG involved presumptive emission control requirements for flexographic and rotogravure. I always say this word wrong, so apologize to those in the industry in the know, but rotogravure printing for publications and for packaging. In 2006, the additional rule covered lithographic and letterpress printing processes and flexible packaging. DAQ's CTG rack rule would adopt the presumptive rack levels recommended by EPA in these 3 documents. In the first stakeholder presentation, I went over some general background on the printing industry and sources of emissions from the industry. I'm not going to go over that again, but I've included some of those background slides for your information, and I refer you back to the video for that first stakeholder meeting if you are interested in the material that I cover in these slides. So I'm just going to skip through the slides quickly. Okay, Araceli, are we on a slide saying CTG rack rule? Because I know sometimes the system can be slow as you're paging through.
Yes, we are.
Great. Okay, so this rule would establish regulations in 5 areas. It would establish VOC content limits or add-on emission control requirements for offset lithographic, letterpress, rotogravure, and flexographic printing operations. It would establish work practice requirements. It would regulate cleaning materials, and it would require covered stationary sources to obtain a permit to operate. And finally, there would be notice, record keeping, and reporting requirements for some sources that claim an exemption under the rule. Who needs to comply with the CTG rack requirements? So Clark County's rule would apply to graphic arts operations that emit greater than or equal to 3 tons per year of VOC from the graphic art operations. So if you have other operations at your facility, you don't need to count them towards the 3 ton per year applicability threshold. You're only looking to count your VOC emissions from the actual graphic art operations. The operations, the stationary source would also need to be located in an area that US EPA designated as non-attainment for an ozone standard and classified as moderate or higher. So right now that applies to HA 212, as Jody explained. But if EPA lowers the standard, passes a new standard, and designate area outside of HA 212 as non-attainment for that ozone standard, and also classifies it higher than moderate, then this rule would be self-implementing at that point because of the way the applicability is structured. Okay, so the rule applies, the rule provides some full or partial exemptions from the requirements of the rule. A full exemption would apply to those listed on this slide. So we've got circuit printing and we've got coding operations that are considered coatings, but are not performed in association with printing. Printing conducted on office and personal printers, such as inkjets, bubble jets, and laser printers. And finally, screen printing operations. Screen printing is most commonly associated with putting graphics on a t-shirt, for example. And so we are not looking to regulate those particular operations under the CTG rule. Now, other states do cover those screening printing operations, but this rule would not. This slide contains a list of exemptions that you would have to comply with. So there's a bunch of different processes, and many years ago, EPA issued guidance on material use limits that apply to graphic art operations so that you could claim what's called minor stationary source status under the Part 70 program, the operating permits program, or for purposes of major NSR. What DAQ did is we took the thresholds that were in that guidance document and we adjusted them to the 3 ton per year level. So if you have these material use limits, you meet these material use limits, then you are exempt from the emission standards and work practice requirements in this rule. You would have to submit an initial notice saying that you're relying on the exemption, and you would have to calculate and record your monthly usage of your graphic art materials and keep those on site and have the total for your calendar year by January 31st of the following year. And these would need to be retained on site for 5 years. Okay. You would also be exempt from the emission standards if you're an offset lithographic printing operation and heat set web letter printing operation vented to a dryer with a potential to emit less than 25 tons per year of VOC before control. You'd also be exempt if you're a stationary source with actual emissions less than 3 tons per year for 3 consecutive years. And book printing and heat set presses with a maximum web width of 22 inches. If you are in that first exemption area, so this one right here, you're still going to be subject to the permitting requirement of the rule and have to comply with the work practice requirements. If you are in the 3 ton per year category, you're going to have to submit a notice, comply with the work practice requirements, comply with the cleaning material requirements, maintain a record of your graphic art materials, and report. So you need to report your actual annual emissions each calendar year for the first two exemptions. Okay, let's get into what the actual standard would require. So for offset lithographic and letterpress printing operations, you're going to have VOC content limits on your printing inks, varnishes, coatings, and adhesives. You're going to need to limit the VOC to less than or equal to 2.5 pounds per gallon, or 300 grams per liter, depending on the measurement system you're using. And that's as applied, less water and exempt compounds. Your fountain solutions will need to have a concentration of alcohol, alcohol substitute, and any other VOCs in the fountain solution that meets the limits in the chart. And this chart, again, is straight out of EPA's CTG guideline document. In lieu of meeting the VOC emission limits on your graphic art materials, you can use an emission control system and maintain the dryer pressure lower than the pressure in the room, so that we're making sure everything's getting to the emission control system. The emission control system overall control efficiency requirements vary based on the installation date of the controls. So we've put January 5th in here because that was the day that EPA bumped up the area to the moderate classification. And based on that date, you're going to have to meet a 90 or 95% control efficiency, or make sure that your outlet to the emission control system is below 20 parts per million dry volume. Okay, flexographic and rotogravure operations, you're going to have limits on your printing inks. You're going to must contain 25% volume percent or less of organic solvents and 75% or more of water. Oh, wait, I've read that wrong. So the solvent fraction of the printing ink as applied to the substrate, less exempt solvents, must contain 25% volume or less of organic solvent. I know I did read that correctly, and 75 volume percent or more of water. The solvent fraction of the printing ink must contain no more than 0.5 pounds of VOC per pounds of solids, or you need the printing ink applied to the substrate less water to contain 60% by volume or more of non-volatile material. So there's 3 different ways in which you can meet a VOC content limit. Alternatively, you can meet an emissions control system. Again, the control system percent and the capture efficiency is driven by the date of installation. Mark 2 EPA's Federal Register notice bumping the area up to moderate. Finally, you can use a combination of controls where you achieve a VOC emissions rate of 0.8 kilograms of VOC per kilogram of solids, or 0.16 pounds of VOC per kilogram of materials applied. And that's an overall control efficiency equivalency of 80% using low VOC coatings and emission control system. For your cleaning materials, you will have a separate standard. The definition of cleaning materials is here on this slide. I'm not going to read through it. The emission standards, you need to use materials with a VOC composite vapor pressure less than 10 mm's of mercury at 20 degrees Celsius, or a cleaning material with less than 70% VOC by weight. There is an exemption in the rule. If you use less than 55 gallons per calendar year, you do not need to comply with the cleaning material requirements. Work practice requirements, very similar to what we've been going over for the entire day for all the source categories. If you have a container that is equal to or larger than 1 gallon, you need to label it with the type of graphic arts material that's in the container. You need to cover your containers when not in use. There is an exception for that requirement to cover for sheet-fed, offset, and letterpress printing inks that use low volatility ink oil as the solvent. Otherwise, if it's out on the floor and it's not in use, it needs to be covered. You need to use closed, non-absorbent, non-leaking containers to store and dispose of your graphic art materials. You need to repair leaks, clean up spills immediately, contain them, clean them up, get them taken care of. Don't let them sit there. Used closed and labeled systems to convey graphic art materials. And finally, in order to ensure that your operators understand the obligations under the rule, you need to conduct quarterly inspections, make sure those containers are closed, and you need to provide new employee and annual operating training on these work practice requirements. Folks subject to the rule for graphic art operations are also going to have to meet permitting requirements. Existing graphic art operations will need to apply for a minor source permit if they don't have a permit already, amend an authority to construct permit if they have one, or their Part 70 operating permit program to put the requirements of this rule in those permits. You'll have 180 days after the effective date of the rule to apply for that permit. And when issued, the permit will include all your monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements to assure that you comply with the rule. New graphic art operations are going to need to submit the permit application before you begin actual construction. Now, DAQ may establish a general permit to cover this category. We're hoping that that is ready to go before the 180-day compliance date, but you'll have to submit a permit either for the general permit or a regular application for the minor source, ATC, or Part 70 permit by that 180-day mark. I also want to make clear that this permitting requirement is extra. It's in addition to any permitting requirements that you may have under the Section 112 permitting rule. So if you undertake a modification at your facility, it's going to bring you into having to comply with this rule, but it wouldn't bring you into the normal thresholds for the permitting program. You still need to get a permit. If you undertake a modification and you trigger permitting under a Section 112 applicability criteria, you're going to need to get both. Well, you won't get 2 permits, you'll get 1 permit, but that permit is going to cover the VOC emissions from this rule, and then everything else that otherwise would have been required of your operations absent this rule. So both rules apply. You need to comply with both the permitting rule and the Section 112 permitting rules. And again, those permits will include the monitoring, record keeping, and reporting for this rule. Compliance date. Existing graphic art operations are going to have to begin to comply with the VOC content limits or the emission control requirements within 180 days of the effective date of the rule. In the rare event that you begin construction right before the effective date of this rule, but you haven't started operations, then comply before you commence normal operations. Same with new graphic art operations. New is going to be defined based on the effective date of the rule. So if you begin actual construction after the rule is passed by the commissioners, then you'll need to submit the permit application before you begin actual construction and comply with the substantive emission control requirements by the time you commence normal operation. Now, I cannot remember whether I said this before, but you are going to have to comply with the rule regardless of whether DAQ gets that permit issued. So the rule, the VOC content limits, the work practice requirements, conducting those inspections, that all goes into effect on the compliance dates that I've gone over. And that's irrespective of whether the permit has been issued. The permit is just going to facilitate enforcement for DAQ and include all the monitoring, record keeping, and reporting that you need to do in order to demonstrate your compliance with the rule. There are some exceptions to the compliance date. For existing sources, there will be a sell-through provision beginning on the effective date of the rule. So if this rule passes at December 5th of 2023, beginning on that date, you may not purchase non-compliant materials unless you intend to use an emissions control system with those materials. But you may use what's in your existing inventory, existing being defined by the effective date of the rule. So on December 5th, 2023, whatever's in your inventory, you can use up to a year after the effective date of the rule without having to comply with the rule. Finally, we realized that these rules have been fast-tracked and that DAQ could not possibly understand all the ins and outs of what an individual stationary source is going to need to do to comply with this standard. So there is going to be a provision in the rule that allows you to ask for an alternative compliance date as part of your permit application. Now, to get that alternative, you're going to need to justify and explain why you can't follow the compliance dates that are in the rule. And propose an alternative date. That date will apply until DAQ acts on your permit application to either deny it or accept your proposed alternative compliance date or set another one when it issues the permit. So I think that covers the exceptions. That applies only to the existing sources. If you're a new source, you're not going to be, you shouldn't have any inventory to use, and you're not going to be able to get a different compliance date by asking for it. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Araceli.
Thank you, Lynn. And we want to go ahead and take any questions related to this rulemaking. Feel free to raise your hand and I'll enable your microphone or post your questions in the chat. Gary, let me go ahead and enable your microphone. You should be okay to speak now. Gary, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. Oh, wait, let me see. Let me try this again for some reason. Okay, there we go.
Okay, all right, we'll get it figured out.
I know.
All right, so wow. I have a lot of questions regarding this proposal. I guess my first question observation is, why does graphic arts require additional record keeping and administrative and reporting burdens where other source categories aren't getting that? Why does graphic arts require facilities to get 2 permits when other source categories aren't requiring facilities to get 2 permits? And I guess with the deviation from the CTG for the limits for inks, the 300 gram per liter limit for inks, which is not in the CTG for EPA, is there going to be a cost economic burden done with this? Because RACT is supposed to be reasonable, and that's not a reasonable limit. So there are some inks that can meet that limit. There's inks that don't meet that limit. So there needs to be, I think, an additional cost justification, as well as perhaps a reason why that's being imposed. The quarterly inspections and annual training is not in anybody's RACT rules for graphic arts. So in looking at all these additional requirements, there's got to be an economic impact analysis done to demonstrate the need and the cost effectiveness of all these requirements. I'm really, really concerned about all these additional requirements that just are getting layered on graphic art sources.
Okay, let me take those in the order that you raised them. So the permitting requirement, I must not have been explaining that clearly. You only need to have one permit, but there are going to be permitting requirements here that apply below the thresholds of the Section 112 program. And that was a decision by DAQ because of the number of sources that are in this industry in the county. They believe that using the permit system is the best way to enforce this rule. And Shibi, I don't know if you're on and you want to add anything to that. Guess not. Okay, so this and the miscellaneous metal parts coating were the two industries where we identified the potential for a number of sources to be within the CTG category, and the permitting program was the best mechanism to ensure compliance with the rule. So that was your first question. The next question, I think, deals with printing inks.
Yeah, before you jump off the permitting,
Okay.
the way you explained it is they have to get a separate permit from under the 112 program, and then if they have to amend it, they have to amend both permits. I mean, maybe I didn't understand it correctly, but
okay, so yeah,
there's two permits.
Yeah, let me try that again. I obviously was babbling and not making a lot of sense. So the normal minor source program applies at 5 tons per year. This program would apply to sources with a 3 ton per year potential to emit. So it's got a lower permitting threshold. So you're going to need to comply with the minor source program at 3 tons per year instead of 5 tons per year. But whereas the permitting program under Section 112 basically requires everything at your facility to get permitted, this would only require you to be permitted for your graphic art operations. So what would happen under a normal Section 112 permit is everything at the facility would get permitted. Here, we're only going to require it for your graphic art operations. So if you stay in that 3 to 5 ton range, only your graphic art operations are going to be permitted. But if you go up to the range of 5 tons, then just like you would if this rule did not exist, you're going to get permitted as a minor source under the normal program. So it's not that you're going to have two separate permits. They'll all be wrapped in and together as one permit, but you're just going to have some requirements in a permit between that 3 and 5 ton level that the Section 112 section talking about MAC too often, Section 12 program would not otherwise have required you to get permitted for. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the question then is what's the justification then for dropping that? The concern is that there's too many facilities. I mean, what's the current inventory like in terms of the emissions from the facilities?
So the inventory is based on EPA has formulas based on population that were used to estimate emissions in the inventory. And we do not think that there is necessarily a good alignment between the emissions in the inventory and what's actually out there when we did a search by business licenses. So we don't know the exact amount of emissions that are out there for the category, but we identified a large number of sources that could potentially be subject. Now, when all this shakes out at the end of the day and we get these applications, we may find out that the rule only applies to 2 sources, and then maybe DAQ would reconsider how they're going to enforce the rule. But right now, based on the information that we have, it could apply to a number of facilities, and permitting was the best way to keep track of compliance for those facilities.
And was there an economic impact analysis done of the cost for permitting, since this is being triggered by the rule?
No, we consulted with Clark County's district attorney's office, and because it is because assurance of compliance is necessary for a regulation, and this is just the mechanism for assuring that compliance, we do not believe that it triggers that requirement.
But if it's being triggered by the rule, it's under the rule. So it's not, it's identifying this particular source category for that particular requirement under the rule. So it's not a broad applicability, doesn't apply to everybody. It's one segment or two segments, I guess, of industry of sources that are being narrowed out and identified for this particular requirement. So I would disagree with that.
Yeah. Okay, please submit those with your comments, and we will definitely reconsult with the district attorney and make sure that we don't move forward with the requirement unless we're in full compliance with Clark County's regulatory provisions for conducting those assessments.
Sure. Okay, great.
Okay. All right. So your next dealt with printing inks, and I gotta say, Gary, I thought I was following the CTGs to the letter. So it may be that, you know, we went and looked at other state rules, and it may be that I pulled the requirements for another state rule and left something. We were going back and forth on what we're going to require, and I may have left something in the rule that wasn't straight out of the CTG. So I'm trying to go back through my slides and see if I can figure out which slide it was that
it's for the offset and letterpress. There's no limits in the CTG for inks or coatings or varnishes. EPA determined because there's such a high retention of the solvent in those inks that there was no reason to regulate them. And for heat set operations, they're going to be ducted to a control device. So that's how the ink VOC is getting controlled.
no, okay. Where's this? Oh, I'm not going to be able to get this. Oh, no, that's what I need to do. I need to do that. Go back. Okay, I think I got it back up on the screen. So you're saying this bullet right here, the first bullet, is not from the CTG?
It's not showing, Lynn.
Yeah.
Oh.
But if it's 300 grams per liter, then yes, it's not in the CTG.
Okay,
Correct.
I will
Yeah.
go back and double check on that, but make sure you put that in your comments, because it was
Right.
not our intent to be more stringent than the presumptive levels in the CTG.
Oh, great.
The only place that I know that I think that we were more stringent than the CTG is on cleaning materials, where the CTG presumptive rack level would have a 30% VOC or higher in the cleaning materials. When we looked at state rules and OTC, they were all at 70% VOC by weight. It was our conclusion that that's probably very common in the marketplace to be able to buy these cleaning materials. And therefore, that is the only area that we intended to be more stringent than what is in the CTG rule. So if we're wrong on the assumption that that is commonly available, because we looked at lots of states and they were at the 70%, let us know. And again, that's the only place we meant to be more stringent.
The 70% is consistent with the CTG. So the CTG says 70% or less than 10 millimeters of mercury. The ACT, which came out in the early 90s, identified potentially at 30%, but EPA realized that those cleaners don't work. So they set it at 70% in the final CTG in 2006.
Okay, so I might have been picking up something old at 30%, thinking that we were being more stringent at 70, but it sounds like we got it right at 70. That's what we were seeing in all the state rules. So that's what we were trying to be consistent with. And then what was your, you had a third concern.
I have a couple other ones. So the cleaning
Okay.
limits, since we're on the topic, it seems that based on your presentation, that applies to all the print processes. Those only apply to the litho and letterpress operations. There's no limits for the flexogravure.
Okay, put that in your.
Yeah, those are caught in the overall requirements. And then it looked to me that you were mixing and matching the flexo and gravure requirements. The CTG that came out in 1978 was for all flexo gravure operations. The CTG that came out in 2006 was for only flexible packaging. So it would be for flexo operations or rotogravure operations that are producing flexible packaging. So the threshold for the 2006 CTG is the 3 tons per year, but the threshold for the 78 is 100 tons per year. And it looked like, looking through those requirements, they were getting jumbled. There wasn't, because the 0.8 requirement, 0.8 kilogram per gram, is for flexible packaging. So the way most states have done this, they've identified 2 separate sub rules, one for just flexogravure, the second is for flexible packaging.
Okay.
Now, flexible packaging can be done with gravure or flexographic printing, but it's a subset of the total industry, if that makes sense.
Yes and no, because I am not a printing expert. So obviously I thought things were talking about the same thing and they weren't. But let me reassure you that it is not DAQ's intent to be more stringent than the presumptive RAC levels. So I urge you to put these in written comments and also take a look at the regulatory draft text. And I'm hoping there's some quick fixes that we can divide things out into subcategories that you might be able to suggest.
Okay. And then my last comment goes back to something similar to, we talked about the 3-ton potential versus actual, but the way I was reading that is that you have, the graphic arts sources need to do additional record keeping on top of that, and additional reporting on top of that. And then followed up with the quarterly inspections and annual training. Again, there's nothing like that that's in the CTGs.
So the CT, I agree on the last point. And I do urge you to look at the draft language relative to what the 3-ton per year sources have to do. But on the inspection and training, so the CTGs that EPA put out do not contain record keeping, monitoring, and reporting recommendations. They just have the presumptive level of emissions control. As we were thinking about what needs to be done in order to demonstrate compliance with these rules, we really felt that the best way to make sure these work practices are being followed in practice is to go around and look. We really did not feel that having, a supervisor walk the work area and make sure that there's covers on the lids. I mean, I've done tons of inspections in coating facilities, and it's not uncommon to find uncovered lids out there in the work field. So, just have somebody go out there, look, make sure there's covers, remind the workers, you need to keep these things covered. and conduct that training so that the workers understand what their obligations are. We're considering that to be monitoring, record keeping, and reporting necessary to assure compliance with the work practice requirements. Otherwise, they're just requirements that could be given lip service and not complied with.
Well, the ultimate test is whenever they get inspected. So if you're going to require quarterly inspections, then there's going to have to be documentation of everything that was inspected and who inspected it and the date of inspection. So now you're adding an administrative record keeping burden. And then the question is, what has to be inspected? Is it just closed containers, or is it every requirement that's in that has to be met with respect to, say, fountain solutions and cleaning solutions and everything else?
It's the work practice requirements. So, you know, that your containers are labeled, that they're not leaking, that they have that they're non-absorbent materials, that they're not sitting out in the work environment with the lids off. There's no inspection of the actual equipment. It's the work practice requirements, which, you know, that there's not an open leak just sitting on the floor that somebody hasn't gone and cleaned up and contained.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a common practice. I mean, OSHA has their requirements with respect to making sure things are closed. I think that's a little bit overkill when you consider the size of these facilities, and then to do annual training on what, work practices?
Correct. It's just the work practices. It's not the emission standards.
I mean, if you do training once, why do you need to retrain them every year on the same thing? I mean, I would say training would be required if there was evidence that people weren't following the requirements or something like that, but just to have a blanket annual training, because then that has to be documented. So you're layering in addition to all the other administrative requirements that people have to do, you're laying additional requirements on top of them for these additional requirements. So again, you're adding a cost burden to the facility, an administrative burden to the facility, and you question what's the value of having to do that.
Do you have an alternative approach to assuring the work practice standards are followed?
Well, ultimately, ultimately it's whether they pass during an inspection, and you realize they can get penalized for having the containers open. So they're motivated to make sure that those containers are closed.
Shivy, I saw you go off mute. So I'm going to turn this over to you.
Yeah, I was trying to speak before and I was on mute. I apologize. Gary, I just wanted to point out one more thing is that, as Lynn mentioned, if the source's potential to emit is 5 tons per year of VOCs, we do have a permitting requirement under Section 12.1 of our regulations right now, which will include this periodic monitoring, record keeping, and annual reporting requirements, including work practice standards. So here we are talking about these sources that are below 5 tons and they're about 3 tons. So we suspect that universe is going to be small. Also, as Lynn mentioned, we thought that's the best way to ensure compliance is to have a permitting requirement. So if you are going to be issuing a permit, that permit definitely will have this additional record keeping and monitoring and reporting requirement consistent with our Section 12.1 minor source permits. So that's what our thought process is, to ensure continuous compliance with these small universal sources. We will be requiring them to have permits and associated compliance demonstration requirements.
Right. I think the important thing to understand here is that sources that are at 3 tons per year are small. When I say small in terms of number of employees, and so they don't have all the resources that exist at much larger facilities. They don't have dedicated EHS professionals. So in reality, it's going to be the owner of the company who has to take on these responsibilities in addition to everything else that they're doing. So the issue is, where do you strike a balance in terms of having compliance be assured and not placing such administrative burden on the facility that it becomes something that isn't observed because they just don't have the time to do it. It's not that they don't necessarily want to do it, but they typically don't have the time to do it. So you have to strike a balance, and with you dropping the permit threshold to a 3 ton per year, that's going to encompass a lot of very, very small printing operations.
Yeah, I think our plan is to follow the model that we do for, say, automobile surface coating operations. They're subject to 6H, 636H, and they have painter training requirements, record keeping requirements, keep a log of their records and submit annual emissions inventory reports. The majority of that compliance that we are right now, we are proposing to use our small business assistance program. The assistance program actively engages with the sources, provide them with the log sheets, provide them with all the other required tools, provide training, help them with their annual reports, get them the logs and everything. So we do have that model right here in our department for that purpose, is to enable or to assist these small businesses to help with complying these rules. So again, we don't necessarily think that there's going to be a huge universe of small sources. Looking at whatever we have obtained, the list of sources, we don't think there's going to be a huge universe of sources. And again, our role preliminarily definitely is going to be through compliance assistance and training, and enforcement is going to be only used at the later stage.
Yeah, but I thought Lynn said there's a large number of sources that have been identified that are subject to the rule, not a small number. So I'm confused as to the universe of covered sources here.
Well,
So
maybe,
when I,
yeah,
I'm sorry,
go ahead.
Shivi, when I say large, I mean in comparison to the other CTG rules.
Right now at 5 tons, I do not think we have a lot of graphic arts that are under our current minor source permitting program. So if I'm going to extrapolate that was just an educated guess from my side.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure. Nobody said a number yet, whether it's large or small. We're just using adjectives to describe the universe. But I mean, I can appreciate your comment about the Small Business Assistance Program, and we work with them closely across the U.S. with many different state programs and outreach programs. We work with them on developing guidance materials for printing operations, and they've been engaged in working with us on general permits. And as you proceed with the general permit, certainly would love to engage with you on the development of the general permit, because there's some good model general permits that states have done that make a lot of sense, and they make the compliance burden easier. So the issue is really compliance burden, and looking at the resources that these facilities have available. The problem with the Small Business Assistance Program is they can't get to everybody. So, and they can do outreach and training, but there's not enough of them, and there's too many covered sources. So it's going to be a challenge in terms of the logistics of getting information out to the regulated community for them to be able to even understand what's required, let alone manage all the requirements. That's why you have to look at the rule level and say, really, what makes sense at a rule level. And then based on that, then you would do your outreach and education.
Yep, good points. And yeah, make sure that you put that in those comments in writing, and we'll definitely consider those in our further processing.
Okay, great, awesome. That was all the questions. That was all the questions I had.
Thank you, Gary. We have another question from Carl Schumacher. He's referring to section 106.5B. The ink VOC content is not typical units of measurements. Typically, you see pounds and gallons minus water and exempt compounds. Most ink suppliers provide data in these units. Can this section be formatted in more typical units of measurements? Lynn, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I
Oh.
was trying to actually pull up.
And I can
the,
allow
the
his,
rule. Yeah.
I can enable his mic in case he needs to, you have questions or he wants to elaborate.
Pounds. Okay, so let me share actual rule. So 1065B is this section right here, which sounds like is not out of the CTG and that I somehow didn't translate this correctly. But it's in pounds of VOC per pounds of solid. Am I in the wrong place in the rule?
No, that's the section I was questioning. It just are these three limits that all must be, are there these alternatives, or are they combination of limits?
They're one, you pick one of the three. There's an or in here.
Is there an or between 1 and 2?
There is not, so that should probably go in there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to make sense of this in terms of what, you purchase inks from an ink supplier and they give you, typically they tell you what the pounds per gallon minus water and exempt, or just pounds per gallon if the particular state doesn't require the subtraction of the water and exempt, so more as applied. But I'm having a hard time with these, trying to figure out what that would be, what the limit would be.
Right. I thought I pulled this language verbatim out of the CTG, but we're open to suggestions of what these VOC content limits should be and how they should be expressed.
Okay, and then I guess just a follow-up question then, D, so just a little bit below this, gives another limit. If your only control is using low VOC inks, for instance, would that be applicable? Would then the 0.16 kilograms VOC per kilogram material applied be a limit that would apply?
No, this is for when you are using both VOC content limits and emission control systems.
What
So
if
it was,
what if the VOC content of the ink is already below that?
So if you're using only the VOC content limits, then you're going to have to meet this up here.
Right. So it'd be nice to know if is D more or less stringent than B, without them being in the same units.
The way that I thought I read it in the CTG, which I could have read it wrong, but EPA provided this as a third control option for a combination system that was driving at getting the same emission reductions that could be achieved either by the emission control system by itself or the VOC content limits. And the overall was trying to achieve an overall efficiency of 80%. And that is the value that they provided as equivalent to an 80% emission control efficiency.
Okay. Well, I think it would make a lot more sense if they were all in the same units, and then it would be easier to follow.
Yeah, I am looking at this and thinking that this was supposed to be gallons right here here. So I'm gonna double check that.
Hey, Lynn, if I can add to that conversation a bit, this D are the requirements for the flexible packaging, and they don't apply to all the flexogravure. I'm not sure what process Carl's using, but in the previous, if you scroll up to where he was talking about the ink limits, the 0.5 doesn't appear, I believe, in any of the CTGs. So I'm not sure where the 4.5 pounds of VOC per pound of solids came from. I have to go back and double check. It's usually the 25 and 60. So, and that's in the 78 CTG. The 0.8 kilogram appeared in the 2006 CTG, and I believe it was, you can have one or the other, and then I guess there was the both. So you picked up the option which allows you to use a combination of both, but they had them as individual limits in the 2006 CTG for the flexible packaging.
Okay. So I might have picked it up out of a state rule. I'll have to go back and look. At any rate, you know, comment on what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what you like, what you don't like.
Yeah, Carl does have a good point. That unfortunately, when these CTGs were written, EPA wasn't thinking pounds per gallon. They've subsequently evolved in their thought process, but when these were originally done in the late 70s, they weren't thinking that. So it's very confusing.
Yeah, I'm thinking that this is supposed to be pounds and this is supposed to be gallons, but I'm not positive, so I need to check on it. Okay.
So you're saying submit comments, and where exactly is one supposed to submit comments?
This is Araceli. I'll go ahead and touch on those.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you guys for your comments. Let me share some slides with you. So here's the rulemaking timeline that we're working with. Today's the workshop day. We would start the 30-day public comment on September 3rd, ending on October 3rd. The rule would go before our Board of County Commissioners for a public hearing and adoption on November 25th, or 21st, I'm sorry, and would become effective on December 5th, 2 weeks later. Lynn referred to some compliance dates in her presentation, and you can find the specifics on those in the rule, and the compliance date would be based on the rule effective date. Next steps are we are considering any comments we received today and any additional written comments received by July 21st. Stakeholders, this is your opportunity to give us your input and help us get this rule right before we release it to the public for comment on September 3rd. You can send your comments to me and I'll share them with the project team. Again, the proposed rule would be released for a 30-day public notice and comment, followed by a public hearing for final adoption. Those who have registered for our mailing list will receive updates on the developments of these rules as well as our attainment plan. So please make sure that you're registered for our mailing list. I posted the links in the chat and it is also available on this slide. Again, you can review our draft rules on our webpage, and workshop presentations and recordings will also be posted on our webpage in the next day or two. And just in summary, we will continue to engage both the industry and public in the development of our rulemakings associated with our ozone attainment plan and the attainment plan itself. Any questions can be directed to me, or modeling questions can be directed to Zhang Li. He's our modeler working on this project. And we can, any questions you have, route them to me, and then I can route them to the individual who can best answer them. And again, please sign up for our registration list so that you can receive updates on our plan and these rulemakings. And with that, let me stop sharing. Are there any final questions before I end this presentation? I'm not hearing anything or seeing any comments in the chat. Again, please submit your comments to us by July 27th. Look at the rules, they're online. The link is in the chat to those rules, and help us get these rules ready so that we can get them out to the public for comment on September 3rd. And we want to thank everybody for their time this morning. I know many of you have stuck around for all workshops, and we really appreciate it. And like I said, any questions, please reach out to me. Thank you, and everybody have a good day.